The ink was still wet on the contract when Julia Thompson realized she had made a terrible mistake, her trembling fingers clutching the paper while her heart hammered against her ribs in the dimly lit office of the employment agency in Mineral Point, Wisconsin. The year was 1878, and she had just signed away her future to a man she had never met, agreeing to work in his household for 5 years, under terms she could barely decipher through her limited reading skills. The agent, a weasel-faced man named Pritchard, had assured her it was standard employment for a housekeeper, but the few words she could make out spoke of restrictions and penalties that made her stomach twist with dread. She stumbled out of the office into the bright June sunlight, the main street of Mineral Point bustling with afternoon activity. Miners covered in lead dust trudged toward the saloons, their voices rough and weary. Women in modest dresses hurried between shops, their bonnets shielding them from the sun. Julia stood there, frozen, clutching the contract to her chest. She had come to Wisconsin from Pennsylvania 3 months ago after her father died in a mining accident, leaving her with nothing but debts and the clothes on her back. At 22 years old, she had thought herself capable of making her own way in the world, but pride had led her to sign documents she could not fully understand. The words on the page blurred together, a jumble of formal legal language that her basic schooling had never prepared her for. Her father had taught her to read simple things, enough to get by, but this contract was filled with terms and clauses that might as well have been written in another language entirely. She knew she should have asked someone to read it for her, but shame had kept her silent. Now she was bound to travel to some remote homestead 40 miles north to work for a man named Silas Vaughn, and the contract stated she could not leave his employment for any reason or face financial penalties she could never hope to pay. Julia walked toward the boarding house where she had been staying, her mind racing. The proprietor, Mrs. Henderson, had been kind enough to extend her credit for another week, but that was all the time she had left. The employment agency had promised her wages would begin immediately, and she desperately needed the money. But something about the contract felt wrong, deeply wrong, and she could not shake the feeling that she had just sold herself into a form of servitude she might not escape. She was so lost in her thoughts that she did not notice the massive figure stepping out of the general store until she collided with what felt like a wall of solid muscle. The impact sent her stumbling backward, and the contract flew from her hands, fluttering down to land in the dusty street. "Watch yourself, miss," came a deep voice, rich and rumbling like distant thunder. Julia looked up, and up further still, until her eyes met the face of the largest man she had ever seen. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they blocked out the sun. His hair was dark brown, hanging past his collar in thick waves that looked like they had been cut with a hunting knife. A full beard covered his jaw, neatly trimmed but wild enough to match the untamed look in his dark eyes. He wore buckskin trousers and a simple cotton shirt that strained across a chest, built from years of hard labor in the wilderness. His arms, bare from the elbows down where he had rolled up his sleeves, were corded with muscle and marked with old scars that spoke of a dangerous life. "I am sorry," Julia stammered, her face flushing with embarrassment. "I was not watching where I was going." The man bent down to retrieve her contract, his movements surprisingly graceful for someone of his size. As he straightened, his eyes fell on the paper in his hand, and Julia saw his expression darken. He read quickly, his jaw tightening with each line, and when he looked back at her, there was something fierce and protective in his gaze that made her breath catch. "You signed this?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Yes," Julia admitted, reaching for the paper. "I need the employment. I have no other options." The man did not hand it back. Instead, he continued reading, and Julia watched as his knuckles whitened around the edges of the contract. Other people moved around them on the street, but he seemed oblivious to everything except the words on the page. Finally, he looked at her again, and there was anger in his eyes, but it was not directed at her. "Do you know what this says?" he demanded. "I know it is an employment contract for a housekeeper position," Julia said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "I will work for Mr. Vaughn for 5 years in exchange for wages and room and board." "It says more than that," the man growled. "It says you agree to work 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, with no days off. It says your wages will be held in trust by Vaughn and only paid out at the end of 5 years, minus any costs he deems necessary for your upkeep. It says if you attempt to leave before the contract is fulfilled, you will owe him $1,000 in penalties, and he has the right to pursue legal action to recover that debt, which could mean debtor's prison. It says he has the right to assign your labor to anyone he chooses, meaning he could send you to work for others and keep your wages. This is not an employment contract. This is indentured servitude, and it is barely legal. Julia felt the blood drain from her face. No, she whispered. The agent said it was standard. He said it was just regular household work. The agent lied, the man said flatly. He looked down at the contract again, then back at her. When did you sign this? Less than an hour ago. I just came from the office. Without another word, the man gripped the contract in both hands and tore it cleanly in half. The sound of ripping paper cut through the street noise like a gunshot, and Julia gasped in shock. He tore it again and again until the contract was nothing but confetti drifting to the ground. What have you done? Julia cried, staring at the destroyed paper in horror. I am bound by that contract. Now I will be in even more trouble. You are not bound by anything, the man said firmly. That contract was designed to trap you. The man who drew it up knows most women in your position cannot read legal language well enough to understand what they are signing. He preys on the desperate. I have seen it before. Julia felt tears prick at her eyes. But I need the money. I have nowhere to go and no way to support myself. The boarding house will turn me out in a week if I cannot pay. The man studied her for a long moment, and Julia felt exposed under his intense gaze. She was tall for a woman, nearly 5 feet 8 inches, but she felt small next to him. Her dark blonde hair was pinned up under her bonnet, and her dress, though clean and mended, was worn thin from years of use. She knew she looked like what she was, a woman at the end of her options, desperate and alone. What is your name? He asked finally. Julia Thompson. I am Bennett Moss, he said. I live in the mountains about 20 miles north of here. I come to town once a month for supplies. I am not good with words or courtesies, Miss Thompson, but I know unfairness when I see it, and what was done to you was wrong. I appreciate your help, Mr. Moss, Julia said quietly. But tearing up the contract does not solve my problems. I still need employment, and now I will have the agency and Mr. Vaughn both angry with me. Bennett's jaw tightened. Let them be angry. You will not go near either of them again. As for employment, I need help at my cabin. Julia blinked in surprise. You're offering me work? I'm offering you fair work for fair wages, Bennett corrected. I spend most of my time trapping and hunting in the wilderness. My cabin is well built, but it needs a woman's touch. The cooking, the cleaning, the mending. I can do those things myself. But it takes time away from my work. I will pay you $20 a month, provide room and board, and you can leave whenever you choose. No contract, no strings, just an honest agreement between two people. $20 a month was more than generous for domestic work in this region. Julia knew she should be suspicious of such an offer, especially from a stranger, but when she looked into Bennett's eyes, she saw only sincerity and a quiet strength that made her want to trust him. Why would you help me? She asked. You do not know me. I know you were being taken advantage of, Bennett said. That is enough. Besides, I could use the help and you need the work. It makes sense. Julia hesitated, her mind racing through her options. She could try to find other employment in Mineral Point, but positions were scarce, and her lack of connections made it nearly impossible. She could attempt to leave town entirely, but she had no money for travel and nowhere to go. Or she could take a chance on this strange, intense man who had literally torn up her troubles and offered her a way forward. I would need to collect my belongings from the boarding house, she said finally. Something that might have been relief crossed Bennett's face. I have business to finish here today. I will meet you at the boarding house in 2 hours. We can leave at first light tomorrow. Julia nodded, and Bennett touched the brim of his worn hat before turning back toward the general store. She watched him go, noting the way people moved aside to let him pass, the way men nodded to him with respect, and women glanced at him with curiosity and perhaps a touch of fear. He was clearly well known in Mineral Point, and she hoped that was a good sign. True to his word, Bennett appeared at the boarding house exactly 2 hours later, carrying a small pack of supplies. Mrs. Henderson, the proprietor, gave him a long, measuring look before pulling Julia aside. "Phew! Are you certain about this, dear?" the older woman asked. "Bennett Moss is a good man by all accounts, but He lives a hard life in the wilderness. It is no place for a refined young woman." "I am not sure I have ever been refined, Mrs. Henderson," Julia said with a sad smile, "and I do not have many choices left." Mrs. Henderson sighed, but nodded. "He has been coming to town for years, never causes trouble, always pays his debts. They say he came out west after the war, wanted to get away from civilization. He has done well for himself with his trapping and hunting. If you are going with him, at least you are going with someone honest." That night, Julia lay awake in her small room at the boarding house, staring at the ceiling and wondering what she had agreed to. She thought about her father, who had worked himself to death in the Pennsylvania mines trying to provide for her after her mother died. She thought about the journey west, full of hope that she could build a new life. She thought about the contract she had almost bound herself to, and the frightening realization of how close she had come to losing her freedom entirely. And she thought about Bennett Moss, with his fierce eyes and gentle hands, who had destroyed that contract without hesitation and offered her something she had not expected: kindness without strings attached. Dawn came cold and clear, with mist rising from the valleys between the hills. Julia dressed in her most practical clothing and packed her few belongings into a worn carpet bag. When she came downstairs, Bennett was already waiting, his massive frame somehow looking comfortable in the small boarding house parlor. He had a large pack on his back and a rifle slung over one shoulder. "Ready?" he asked simply. Julia nodded, and together they stepped out into the gray morning light. Bennett had a sturdy horse waiting, a big gelding with patient eyes. He secured Julia's bag to the saddle along with his supplies, then looked at her. "Can you ride?" "Not well," Julia admitted. "You will ride with me then. It is easier than walking 20 miles through rough country." He swung up into the saddle with easy strength, then reached down to pull Julia up behind him. She settled onto the horse's back, acutely aware of the solid warmth of Bennett's body in front of her. After a moment's hesitation, she wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling the hard muscle beneath his shirt. "Hold tight," Bennett said, and urged the horse forward. They rode north out of Mineral Point as the sun rose, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The town fell away behind them, replaced by rolling hills covered in thick forest. Wisconsin in the summer was lush and green, wildflowers blooming in meadows and birds singing from every tree. The air smelled of pine and earth and growing things. Bennett kept the horse to a steady walk, navigating trails that were barely visible to Julia's untrained eyes. He did not speak much, but there was something comfortable about his silence. It was not the awkward quiet of two strangers, but rather the peaceful quiet of someone who was content with the world around him. After about an hour, Bennett spoke. "I should tell you about the cabin before we get there. It is not fancy. One main room with a sleeping loft, a stone fireplace, a good roof. I built it myself 5 years ago when I first came to this area. It is isolated. The nearest neighbor is 8 miles away, a Swedish family who keep to themselves mostly. Town is 20 miles, which means trips are infrequent, especially in winter. It can be lonely." "I have been lonely in the middle of a crowded city," Julia said quietly. "At least in the wilderness, the loneliness is honest." She felt Bennett's back straighten slightly, as if her words had surprised him. "That's a good way to put it." They stopped around midday to rest the horse and eat. Bennett had brought bread and cheese, which they shared while sitting on a fallen log beside a clear stream. Julia watched him as he ate, noting the careful, economical way he moved, as if he were always conscious of conserving energy. His hands were huge, scarred and calloused from hard work, but he handled the food with surprising delicacy. "You said you came out here after the war," Julia ventured. "Were you a soldier?" Bennett's expression darkened. "I was. Joined when I was 17, fought until it ended. Saw things no one should see, did things I try not to think about. When it was over, I could not go back to my old life. The cities felt too crowded, too loud. I needed space and silence. So I came west." "I am sorry," Julia said softly. "It was a long time ago." Bennett stood, brushing crumbs from his pants. "We should keep moving. I want to reach the cabin before dark." They rode on through the afternoon, climbing higher into the hills. The forest grew thicker, older, with massive oaks and pines that blocked out much of the sky. Julia saw a deer watching them from the shadows, rabbits scurrying across the path, and once, far in the distance, what might have been a bear. Bennett seemed completely at ease in this wild place, guiding the horse around obstacles and through streams with practiced skill. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, they emerged into a clearing beside a small lake. On the far side of the clearing stood Bennett's cabin, and Julia felt her breath catch. It was larger than she had expected, built from thick logs chinked with mud and moss. The roof was made of split shingles, and a stone chimney rose from one end. A small porch ran along the front, and there was a separate shed for storage. Behind the cabin, she could see a garden plot and what looked like a chicken coop. "This is beautiful," Julia said, genuine wonder in her voice. Bennett glanced back at her, and for the first time, she saw something that might have been pleasure in his expression. "I've worked hard on it. It is a good place." He helped her down from the horse, his hands strong and steady on her waist, and Julia felt a flutter in her stomach at the contact. She told herself it was just nerves from the long journey, but she knew it was more than that. There was something about Bennett Moss that drew her in, something beyond his obvious strength and rugged good looks. It was the quiet integrity in his eyes, the way he had stood up for her without hesitation, the sense that he was a man who kept his word. The interior of the cabin was as well crafted as the exterior. The main room was spacious, with the stone fireplace dominating one wall and a sturdy table with chairs in the center. There was a cooking area with an iron stove, shelves lined with supplies, and windows that let in the evening light. A ladder led up to a sleeping loft, and Julia could see a bed with thick furs for covers. "You can have the loft," Bennett said, following her gaze. "I will make a bedroll down here by the fire. There's a wash basin behind that screen in the corner, and the privy is about 30 yards behind the cabin. I know it is not what you are accustomed to." "It is wonderful," Julia said honestly. "Better than anywhere I have lived in a long time." Bennett looked at her for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether she was being truthful or just polite. Whatever he saw in her face seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded and began unpacking their supplies. They worked together to prepare a simple dinner of salt pork, beans, and cornbread. Julia found herself falling into an easy rhythm with Bennett, their movements coordinating without need for many words. He was efficient in the kitchen, clearly used to cooking for himself, but he seemed pleased to let her take over the tasks that required a lighter touch. As they ate, Bennett told her more about his life in the mountains. He trapped beaver, mink, and other fur-bearing animals in the winter, selling the pelts in town for good money. In the summer, he hunted deer and fished the lake, preserving meat for the cold months. He had built up a reputation for quality furs and fair dealing, which meant buyers sought him out rather than the other way around. It was a solitary life, but profitable, and he liked the independence. "What happened to your family?" Julia asked, then immediately regretted the question when she saw his face close off. "I'm sorry. That was too personal." "No, it is all right," Bennett said after a moment. "You should know who you are living with. My parents died when I was young. Fever took them both within a week of each other. I was raised by my uncle, who was not a kind man. When the war started, I lied about my age to enlist. It was a way out. After the war, I had no reason to go back. No family, no ties. This life suits me." "It must be lonely sometimes," Julia said softly. "It is," Bennett admitted, "but it is also peaceful. Out here, I do not have to pretend to be something I am not. I do not have to make small talk or follow social rules that make no sense to me. I can just be." Julia understood that feeling more than she could express. She had spent so much of her life trying to be the dutiful daughter, the proper young woman, always aware of how she was supposed to act and speak. Here, in this wild place with this honest man, she felt like she could breathe for the first time in years. That night, Julia climbed into the loft and lay down on the surprisingly comfortable bed. Through the floorboards, she could hear Bennett moving around below, banking the fire and settling down for the night. She stared up at the rough wooden ceiling, listening to the sounds of the forest outside, and felt something she had not felt in a long time: hope. The next days fell into a pattern that was both strange and comforting. Julia woke with the dawn, when light streamed through the loft window, and climbed down to find Bennett already up and working. He would go out to check his snares or work on various projects around the cabin, while Julia took over the domestic tasks. She cooked meals that were far better than anything Bennett had been making for himself, using herbs she found growing wild near the cabin. She cleaned and organized, mended his worn clothes, and began working on improving the garden plot. It was hard work, physical in a way that her life in Pennsylvania had never been, but Julia found she enjoyed it. There was satisfaction in seeing tangible results from her labor, and the way the cabin became more comfortable and homelike under her care. And there was something deeply appealing about the simplicity of this life, the way each day had clear purpose and meaning. Bennett was a quiet presence, but Julia began to notice small things about him. The way he always made sure there was fresh water hauled up from the lake before she asked. The way he brought her wildflowers he had found during his morning rounds, presenting them awkwardly as if unsure whether she would want them. The way his eyes followed her when he thought she was not looking, with an intensity that made her heart race. She noticed his strength, too. She had thought herself prepared for how powerful he was, but actually seeing him work drove it home in ways that left her breathless. He could lift logs that must have weighed 200 pounds as if they were kindling. His arms, when he rolled up his sleeves to work, were corded with muscle that shifted and bunched with each movement. When he chopped wood, the axe moved through the air with such force that each log split with a single blow, and Julia found herself watching from the cabin window, mesmerized by the controlled power in every swing. But it was not just his physical strength that drew her, it was the gentleness that lived alongside it, the way he handled injured animals he found in his traps, putting them out of their misery quickly and respectfully rather than letting them suffer. The way he spoke to his horse, his voice low and soothing. The way he moved around her in the cabin, always careful not to crowd her or make her uncomfortable, despite his size. One evening, about 2 weeks after Julia had arrived, a summer storm rolled in from the west. She had been working in the garden when the sky suddenly darkened, and she barely made it back to the cabin before the rain began. It came down in sheets, driven by howling wind that made the trees bend and creak. Lightning flashed across the sky, followed by thunder that shook the cabin walls. Julia stood at the window, watching the storm with wide eyes. Bennett came up beside her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Storms like this always remind me how small we are," he said quietly. "Nature does not care about our plans or our problems. It just is." "It is terrifying," Julia admitted, "and beautiful." "Yes," Bennett agreed, and when she glanced at him, he was not looking at the storm. He was looking at her. The moment stretched between them, charged with something more powerful than the lightning outside. Julia felt her breath catch, felt her body lean slightly toward him, drawn by an attraction she had been trying to ignore. Bennett's hand came up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently tucked a strand of hair that had escaped her bun behind her ear. His fingers brushed her cheek, and Julia felt that light touch all the way down to her toes. "Julia," Bennett said, his voice rough, "I need you to know something. When I brought you here, it was to help you, to give you a safe place to work and earn money. But I'm finding it harder and harder to remember that you are just my employee. The truth is, I am drawn to you in ways I have not felt about anyone before. If that makes you uncomfortable, tell me now, and I will keep my distance. But I wanted to be honest." Julia's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. She looked up at him, at this massive, powerful man who was looking at her with such vulnerability in his eyes, and she realized that she had been lying to herself. She had not taken this job just for the money or the safety. She had taken it because from the moment Bennett Moss had torn up that contract and offered her his protection, something in her had recognized something in him. A matching loneliness, a similar kind of strength born from hardship, a capacity for love that had been locked away, waiting for the right person to open it. "It does not make me uncomfortable," she whispered. "I feel it too." Bennett's eyes darkened, and he took a step closer, his hand sliding from her cheek to cup the back of her neck. "I am not good with pretty words," he said, "and I am not a gentleman by any measure, but I want you to know that you are safe with me, always. Nothing will happen between us unless you want it. Do you understand?" "I understand," Julia said, and then, gathering her courage, she rose up on her toes and kissed him. For a moment Bennett froze, as if shocked by her boldness. Then he made a sound low in his throat and pulled her against him, kissing her back with a hunger that stole her breath. His arms wrapped around her, holding her as if she were something precious and fragile, despite the strength in his body. The kiss was deep and searching, full of all the longing they had both been holding back. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Bennett rested his forehead against hers. "Julia," he said again, her name like a prayer on his lips. "I know this is fast," Julia said shakily. "I know we have only known each other for 2 weeks. But Bennett, I feel like I have been looking for you my whole life without knowing it. You make me feel safe and valued in a way no one ever has. When I'm with you, I can be myself without fear of judgment. That is worth more than any pretty words or courtly manners." "You deserve pretty words," Bennett insisted. "You deserve someone who can give you a comfortable life in town, with nice dresses and social gatherings and all the things women want." "I want this," Julia said firmly, placing her hand on his chest, feeling his heart thunder beneath her palm. "I want you. I want this life. I want to wake up in this cabin and see the sun rise over the lake. I want to work beside you and build something real. That is what I want." Bennett kissed her again, slower this time, tender and reverent. Then he pulled back, his hands on her shoulders, and looked at her seriously. "If we do this, I need you to understand what you are choosing. Winters here are brutal. We can be snowed in for weeks at a time. The closest town is a half-day ride, and we might only make it there once or twice between November and March. It is a hard life, Julia, harder than anything you have known." "My father died in a mine collapse trying to earn enough money to feed us," Julia said quietly. "My mother died of pneumonia in a one-room tenement because we could not afford a doctor. I have sewn until my fingers bled, taken in laundry until my hands were raw, and gone to bed hungry more times than I can count. I am not afraid of hard work, Bennett, and I'm not afraid of isolation. What I'm afraid of is going back to a world where I have to pretend to be less than I am, where I have to accept whatever scraps are thrown my way and be grateful for them. Here, with you, I can be strong. I can be myself. That is worth more than any comfort." Bennett pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. Julia wrapped her arms around his waist, amazed at how solid he felt, how right it felt to be held by him. They stood like that for a long time, listening to the storm rage outside, safe and warm in their cabin. From that night forward, something shifted between them. They were still careful, still learning about each other, but the walls had come down. They talked more, sharing stories from their pasts. Bennett told her about the war, about the friends he had lost and the scars he carried, both visible and invisible. Julia told him about her childhood, about her father's dreams and her mother's quiet strength, about the fear and desperation that had driven her to sign that terrible contract. They worked together during the days, and Bennett began teaching Julia the skills she would need to thrive in the wilderness. He showed her how to identify edible plants, how to track animals, how to read the signs of changing weather. He taught her to shoot his rifle, standing behind her with his arms around her as he helped her line up the sight, his breath warm on her neck. Julia was a quick learner, and Bennett made a good teacher, patient and thorough. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the lake, talking or simply enjoying the comfortable silence. Sometimes Bennett would play a battered harmonica he kept, filling the air with simple melodies that were surprisingly sweet. Other times, Julia would read aloud from the few books Bennett owned, her voice soft in the gathering darkness. One afternoon, about a month after Julia had arrived, they were working together to repair a section of the cabin's roof when a rider appeared at the edge of the clearing. Bennett tensed immediately, his hand moving instinctively to the knife at his belt. Julia recognized his posture, the way he positioned himself between her and the potential threat, and felt a rush of warmth at his protectiveness. The rider was a man in his 40s, well-dressed in a city suit that looked absurdly out of place in the wilderness. He rode directly up to the cabin, his expression arrogant and annoyed. "You there," he called up to Bennett. "Are you Bennett Moss?" "I am," Bennett said, his voice flat and unwelcoming. "What do you want?" "My name is Silas Vaughn. I am looking for a woman named Julia Thompson. I was told in town that she left with you a month ago." Julia felt ice flood her veins. This was the man from the contract, the one who had tried to trap her into servitude. Bennett climbed down from the roof in one fluid motion, landing lightly despite the distance. He walked toward Vaughn, and Julia could see the dangerous tension in his body. "Miss Thompson is under my protection," Bennett said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. "She has no business with you." Vaughn's face reddened. She has every business with me. She signed a contract agreeing to work for me. When she failed to appear, I made inquiries. I was told some mountain brute tore up her contract in the middle of Mineral Point. That contract was legally binding, and I intend to enforce it. The contract was fraudulent, Bennett said. It was designed to trap a vulnerable woman into servitude. Julia signed it under false pretenses, not understanding the terms. That makes it invalid. She signed it willingly, Vaughn insisted. Her ignorance does not invalidate the contract. I have invested money in recruiting her, and I expect her to fulfill her obligations. If she does not come with me now, I will pursue legal action. Julia climbed down from the roof and came to stand beside Bennett. I'm not going anywhere with you. Mr. Vaughn, the contract you had me sign was unconscionable, and I will not honor it. Vaughn's eyes narrowed as he looked at her. You stupid girl. Do you think you can just walk away from your obligations? I will have you arrested for breach of contract. You will end up in debtor's prison, do you understand? You will rot there. She will not, Bennett said, and there was something in his voice that made Vaughn's horse shy nervously. Because you are going to ride back to town and tell the employment agency that Julia Thompson's contract is void. You are going to drop any claims against her, and then you are going to stay far away from her. Or what? Vaughn sneered. What are you going to do, you backwoods savage? Bennett moved faster than Julia would have thought possible for a man his size. One moment he was standing beside her, the next he had crossed the distance to Vaughn's horse and grabbed the man by his expensive coat, hauling him bodily out of the saddle. Vaughn hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of him, and looked up in terror at Bennett looming over him. Or I will make you regret ever hearing Julia's name, Bennett said, his voice deadly calm. I know men like you. You prey on the desperate and the vulnerable because you think no one will stand up for them. But Julia has someone standing up for her now. She has me. And I promise you, if you pursue this, if you so much as speak her name in town, I will come for you. Do you understand? Vaughn nodded frantically, his earlier arrogance completely gone. Bennett released him and stepped back, watching as the man scrambled to his feet and practically threw himself back onto his horse. Vaughn rode out of the clearing at a gallop, not looking back. Julia realized she was shaking, not from fear, but from the rush of emotions flooding through her. Bennett turned to her, and she saw the concern in his eyes. Are you all right? He asked. I am fine, Julia said. I am better than fine. Thank you, Bennett. Thank you for protecting me. Always, Bennett said simply, and pulled her into his arms. That night, as they lay in front of the fire, Bennett on his bedroll and Julia having climbed down from the loft to be near him, they talked about what had happened. Do you think he will actually drop the case? Julia asked, her head resting on Bennett's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Yes, Bennett said. Men like Vaughn are cowards at heart. They only fight when they think they can win easily. He knows now that pursuing you means dealing with me, and he does not want that. But even if he does try to press charges, they will not stand up. I have friends in town, people who know me and will testify to the fraudulent nature of that contract. You are safe, Julia, I promise you. Julia tilted her head up to look at him. In the firelight, his face was all plains and shadows, beautiful in its rugged strength. I love you, she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. I know it is too soon, and I know you probably do not feel the same way yet, but I needed to say it. You have given me so much, Bennett, not just safety and employment, but hope. You have shown me what it means to be valued, to be protected, not because I am weak, but because I am cherished. I love you for that. Bennett's arms tightened around her, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. I love you too, Julia. I have loved you since the moment I saw you standing in that street, scared but brave, trying to make your way in a world that had been unkind to you. I love your strength, your intelligence, your kindness. I love the way you see beauty in this rough life. I love how you make this cabin feel like a home. I love you, and I want you to stay with me, not as my employee, but as my partner, as my wife, if you will have me. Julia felt tears spill down her cheeks, but they were tears of joy. Yes, she whispered, yes, I will marry you. Bennett kissed her then, deep and passionate, and Julia felt like she was finally truly home. They were married a week later in Mineral Point by the circuit judge, who happened to be passing through town. It was a simple ceremony, with Mrs. Henderson and the general store owner serving as witnesses. Julia wore a dress that Mrs. Henderson had helped her alter from one of the older woman's own gowns, a soft blue cotton that brought out the color of Julia's eyes. Bennett wore his best clothes, his hair neatly combed and his beard trimmed, and Julia thought she had never seen a more handsome man. After the ceremony, Bennett bought Julia a simple gold band from the general store, sliding it onto her finger with hands that were surprisingly gentle. They stayed in town that night at the boarding house in the nicest room Mrs. Henderson had, and for the first time, they made love as husband and wife. Bennett was tender and patient, careful of Julia's inexperience, and Julia felt herself fall even more deeply in love with this man who was so strong and yet so gentle with her. They returned to the cabin the next day, and life took on a new sweetness. Julia now slept in the loft with Bennett, their bodies tangled together under the warm furs. They worked together during the days and made love in the evenings, learning each other's bodies with increasing confidence and joy. The isolation that might have been lonely before now felt perfect, giving them privacy to build their relationship without the prying eyes and opinions of others. Summer turned to fall, and Julia watched in awe as the forest around their cabin transformed into a riot of red, orange, and gold. Bennett was busier now, preparing for winter. He hunted deer and preserved the meat, salting and smoking it. He caught fish from the lake and dried them. He cut and stacked wood until there was a massive pile behind the cabin, enough to keep them warm through the coldest months. Julia helped as much as she could, learning to preserve vegetables from the garden, to make soap and candles, to prepare the cabin for the long winter ahead. She also began working on gifts for Bennett, sewing him new shirts from fabric she had purchased in town, embroidering his initials on the collars with careful stitches. One afternoon in late October, Julia felt a wave of nausea wash over her while she was preparing dinner. She barely made it outside before she was sick, and Bennett came running from the woodpile where he had been working. "What is wrong?" he demanded, his face pale with worry. "Are you ill? Do we need to get you to a doctor?" Julia straightened, wiping her mouth with a shaky hand, and then realized what was happening. She had missed her monthly courses twice now, and she had been feeling tired in a way that was different from mere physical exhaustion. She looked up at Bennett, and a smile spread across her face. "I am not ill," she said. "Bennett, I think I am with child." For a moment, Bennett just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then his face transformed, breaking into the widest smile Julia had ever seen on him. He let out a whoop of joy and picked her up, spinning her around despite her protests that he would make her dizzy. "A baby," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "We are going to have a baby." "Yes," Julia laughed, holding onto his shoulders. "If you do not put me down and let me stop spinning, we are going to have a very nauseated baby." Bennett set her down carefully, then dropped to his knees in front of her, pressing his face against her still flat stomach. "Hello in there," he said softly. "This is your father. I cannot wait to meet you." Julia ran her fingers through his hair, overcome with emotion. "You're going to be a wonderful father," she whispered. "I will try," Bennett promised, looking up at her with shining eyes. "God, Julia, I will try so hard to be good enough for both of you." "You already are," Julia assured him. Winter came early that year, with the first snow falling in mid-November. By December, they were snowed in completely, the world outside the cabin transformed into a white wonderland. Julia had worried about feeling trapped, but instead, she found the forced isolation peaceful. She and Bennett fell into a comfortable rhythm, spending their days maintaining the cabin, playing cards and reading, making love in front of the fire while the wind howled outside. Bennett was attentive to Julia's pregnancy, almost comically so. He insisted she rest more, refused to let her do any heavy lifting, and constantly fretted about whether she was eating enough. Julia found his protectiveness endearing, even when it verged on overbearing. One night in January, when the cold was so intense that frost formed on the inside of the windows despite the roaring fire, they lay together in bed and talked about their future. "What do you hope for?" Julia asked, her hand resting on the small swell of her belly. "For the baby, I mean. What kind of life do you want for them?" Bennett was quiet for a moment, thinking. "I want them to be strong," he said finally. Not just physically, but here. He tapped his chest. I want them to know their own worth, to never let anyone make them feel less than they are. I want them to know they are loved, always, no matter what. And I want them to have choices, Julia. I want them to be able to choose their own path, not be forced into something because they have no other option. Like I was, Julia said softly. Like we both were, Bennett corrected. I joined the army because I had no other way out. You almost signed that contract because you were desperate. Our child will never know that kind of desperation. We will make sure of it. Do you want more? Julia asked. More children, I mean. As many as you are willing to give me, Bennett said, kissing her forehead. I spent so many years alone, Julia. Now that I have you, now that we are building a family, I want it all. I want this cabin full of noise and laughter and life. I want to grow old with you and watch our grandchildren play by the lake. I want everything I never thought I could have. Then that is what we will have, Julia promised. The baby was born in late June, during a thunderstorm that reminded Julia of that first storm when she and Bennett had admitted their feelings to each other. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Bennett, who had delivered foals and calves but never a human baby, looked terrified that something would go wrong. But Julia was strong, and when their son finally entered the world, red-faced and screaming, Bennett wept openly with joy and relief. They named him Thomas after Julia's father, and he was perfect. He had Bennett's dark hair and Julia's blue eyes, and from the moment he was born, he owned his father's heart completely. Bennett was an amazing father, patient and gentle with the tiny infant, singing to him in his deep voice and carrying him everywhere in a sling Julia had made. Life fell into a new rhythm now, centered around the needs of their son. Julia marveled at how naturally Bennett took to fatherhood, how this man who had lived alone for so long was so comfortable with a helpless infant. He changed diapers without complaint, walked the floor with Thomas during the night so Julia could sleep, and looked at their son with such pure love that it made Julia's heart ache. Thomas grew into a sturdy toddler, curious and fearless, exploring every inch of the cabin and the clearing around it. Bennett made him a wooden horse that Thomas dragged everywhere, and Julia sewed him clothes that he managed to get dirty within minutes of putting them on. They were happy, the three of them, building a life together in their wilderness home. When Thomas was 2, Julia became pregnant again, and this time she carried a daughter they named Margaret, after Bennett's mother. Margaret was quieter than Thomas had been, with a serious expression that made her look like a tiny philosopher. Thomas adored his baby sister, and Bennett joked that they would need to keep the boys away when she grew older, because she was going to be a beauty. The years passed in a blur of children and seasons. They added another room to the cabin as the family grew, and then another. 2 more sons followed Margaret, strong boys they named Samuel and James, and then twin daughters, Rose and Lily, who were identical in appearance but completely opposite in temperament. Bennett proved to be not just a good father, but an exceptional one. He taught his sons to hunt and trap and work with their hands, but he also taught them to read and write, to think for themselves, to treat others with respect. He taught his daughters the same skills he taught his sons, insisting that they needed to know how to take care of themselves in this wild country. Julia watched him with their children and fell more in love with him every day. They made trips to Mineral Point twice a year, the whole family crowding onto a wagon Bennett had built. The town had grown over the years, and there were more people who remembered Julia's arrival, who knew the story of how Bennett had torn up that fraudulent contract. They were respected in town, known as hard workers who kept their word and raised good children. On one of these trips, when Thomas was about 10 years old, they encountered Silas Vaughn on the main street. He was older now, his face lined and his expensive clothes somewhat worn. When he saw Bennett, he paled and crossed to the other side of the street without a word. Julia watched him go and felt nothing but pity. Whatever wealth and power he had accumulated through his schemes had not brought him happiness. Meanwhile, she had everything she had ever wanted. The children grew and thrived. Thomas became a tall, strong young man, as big as his father and just as quiet. He took over more and more of the heavy work around the cabin, and Bennett began teaching him the secrets of finding the best trapping grounds. Margaret grew into a beautiful young woman with a sharp mind and her mother's kind heart. She wanted to be a teacher, and Bennett and Julia were saving money to send her to a normal school in Milwaukee when she turned 18. Samuel and James were inseparable, always getting into mischief together, but always backing each other up. The twins, Rose and Lily, were 12 now, wild and free as the forest they had grown up in, riding horses bareback and climbing trees like they had been born to it. One evening, as Julia and Bennett sat on the porch watching the sunset over the lake, Bennett took her hand. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Choosing this life?" Julia looked at him in surprise. "Never, not for a single moment. Why would you ask that?" "I see how hard you work," Bennett said. "I see your hands, rough from labor. I see how tired you are at the end of the day. You could have had an easier life." "I could have had a life where I was trapped and exploited," Julia corrected, "where I had no voice and no choice. This life is hard, yes, but it is mine. Ours. We built this together, Bennett. Every room in this cabin, every child, every moment of happiness, I would not trade it for anything." Bennett lifted her hand to his lips, kissing the roughened knuckles. "I love you," he said. "I loved you from the moment I met you, and I will love you until I take my last breath." "I know," Julia said softly. "And I love you the same way." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the colors fade from the sky. Inside the cabin, they could hear the children talking and laughing, the sounds of a family together. It was a good sound, a sound that spoke of love and security and belonging. Years continued to pass. Thomas married a sweet girl from town, and they built their own cabin 5 miles from Bennett and Julia's place. Margaret went to normal school and came back to teach in Mineral Point, eventually marrying a kind young doctor. Samuel and James took over the trapping business from their father, working together as they always had. Rose and Lily were the last to leave, both marrying in the same year, twins to the end. Bennett and Julia found themselves alone again in the cabin, just as they had been at the beginning. They were older now, their hair streaked with gray, their bodies marked by years of hard work. But they were still strong, still healthy, and most importantly, still deeply in love. They spent their days tending a smaller garden, fishing in the lake, and traveling to visit their children and growing number of grandchildren. The cabin that had once seemed so remote was now the center of a sprawling family, with children and grandchildren visiting regularly, filling the rooms with noise and laughter, just as Bennett had wanted all those years ago. One summer evening, when they were both in their 60s, Julia and Bennett walked down to the lake, hand in hand just as they had done countless times before. They sat on the dock Bennett had built when Thomas was a boy, dangling their feet in the cool water and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. "Do you remember the storm?" Julia asked. "That first summer when we admitted our feelings?" "I remember everything," Bennett said. "I remember every moment we have shared, Julia, every joy, every sorrow, every ordinary day. They are all precious to me." "We have had a good life," Julia said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "The best life," Bennett agreed. "Better than I ever thought possible." They sat in silence for a while, watching the light fade and the stars begin to appear. Finally, Bennett spoke again. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For taking a chance on me, for choosing this life, for giving me a family, a purpose, a reason to be more than I was, for loving me." Julia lifted her head to look at him. Even after all these years, his face was still the most handsome thing she had ever seen. There were lines around his eyes now, and his beard was more gray than brown, but his eyes were the same, still looking at her with that same intensity and love. "You gave me all the same things," she said. "You saved me, Bennett. Not just from that contract, but from a life of fear and uncertainty. You gave me strength and courage. You gave me love. You gave me everything." Bennett cupped her face in his big scarred hands and kissed her softly. "Then we saved each other," he said. As the stars came out overhead and the lake whispered against the shore, Julia and Bennett Moss sat together, their hands intertwined, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a love that would last forever. They had started with nothing but a torn contract and a desperate hope, and they had created a legacy of love that would live on in their children and their children's children. The mountain man and the woman who could not read the contract that almost enslaved her had found their happy ending, not in spite of the hard life they had chosen, but because of it. They had built something real and lasting, something that mattered, and as they sat together watching the night deepen around them, they knew that they had been blessed beyond measure. Their story was one of courage and kindness, of standing up for what was right and choosing love even when it was not easy. It was a story of two broken people who had healed each other, who had created light out of darkness. And it was a story that would be told by their descendants for generations to come, a reminder that sometimes the best things in life come from taking a chance on someone who sees your worth when you cannot see it yourself. Julia and Bennett lived many more years together, watching their family grow and prosper. They saw Thomas take over the family trapping business and expand it, becoming one of the most successful fur traders in the region. They watched Margaret's school grow from a one-room schoolhouse to a proper building with 3 teachers. They celebrated Samuel and James's successes, and they delighted in watching Rose and Lily raise their own families. When Bennett finally passed away at the age of 78, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, Julia held his hand and whispered that she would see him again soon. He smiled at her, that same gentle smile he had given her so many times over their decades together, and said her name one last time. Julia, the word full of all the love he had never quite been able to express in words but had shown her every single day of their life together. Julia lived 3 more years without him, cared for by her children who would not hear of her living alone. She spent those years telling stories to her grandchildren, making sure they knew the man their grandfather had been, the love he had given, the values he had lived by. She told them about the day they met, about the contract he had torn up, about the life they had built together. When Julia passed in her sleep one winter night, the family buried her beside Bennett on a hill overlooking the lake. The whole family gathered, dozens of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all there to honor the woman who had been the heart of their family. Thomas, now a gray-haired man himself, stood at his mother's grave and spoke to the assembled family. "My father once told me that he saved our mother from a terrible fate," he said. "But the truth is, they saved each other. They built something beautiful out of nothing. They loved fiercely and completely, and they showed all of us what it means to be truly devoted to another person. We are all here because they took a chance on love, because they chose each other every single day. That is their legacy to us, and it is a precious one." The family agreed, and as they left the gravesite, they each took a moment to say their own private goodbyes to the grandmother who had taught them so much about love, strength, and the importance of family. Years later, the cabin still stood, maintained by the family as a reminder of where they had all come from. They would gather there each summer, all the descendants of Bennett and Julia Moss, to celebrate the anniversary of the day those two souls had found each other in the streets of Mineral Point. The story of the mountain man who had torn up an unfair contract and the woman who had chosen a hard life over an easy servitude became family legend, passed down through generations. It was told to children to teach them about standing up for what was right, to teenagers to teach them about true love, to adults to remind them of what really mattered in life. And in the quiet moments, when family members stood on the porch of that old cabin looking out over the lake, they could almost feel the presence of Bennett and Julia, still together, still watching over the family they had created, still embodying the love that had started it all those years ago with a torn contract and a leap of faith. The legacy of Bennett and Julia Moss lived on, a testament to the power of love, the importance of standing up for others, and the beauty that can bloom when two people choose each other against all odds. Their story was complete, their love eternal, and their happy ending truly earned. In a world that had tried to trap Julia in servitude and had offered Bennett only isolation, they had found each other and created something magnificent. A love story for the ages, set against the wild beauty of the Wisconsin wilderness, as enduring as the mountains and as deep as the lake that had witnessed their devotion.